For 30 days, Eleanor Hale was a wife in name only. No shared bed, no lingering glances across the breakfast table, only a vast, echoing estate and a husband who vanished behind a locked door the moment the sun touched the horizon. The servants whispered that he was cursed. Her own family assumed he was cruel, or worse, indifferent. But when Eleanor finally forced open the door, he had spent a month protecting. She did not find another woman waiting on the other side. She found a war that had never ended. If you have ever loved someone who seemed determined to disappear, listen to what she found in that room, and what it cost them both to close the door on it for good. The ink on the marriage register at St. Bartholomew's took scarcely 2 minutes to dry. Eleanor Whitcomb counted every second of it, standing in the cold stone vestibule in a gown 3 sizes too fine for a bride who felt nothing resembling joy. Beside her stood Edmund Hale, Duke of Summerley, 33 years old, immensely wealthy, and entirely somewhere else, though his body remained fixed politely at her side. He had spoken 11 words to her since his arrival at the church. "You look well this morning. Shall we proceed?" Eleanor's mother had wept quietly into a handkerchief throughout the brief ceremony, though whether from sentiment or relief at the size of the settlement, Eleanor could not entirely say. Her father had not attended at all, having taken himself off to Bath the week prior to avoid the creditors his daughter's marriage was meant, in part, to satisfy. There had been no wedding breakfast, no gathering of well-wishers. Edmund's solicitor had witnessed the register alongside a clerk pulled in from the street, and within the hour Eleanor found herself installed in a travelling coach bearing a crest she did not yet recognize as her own. Their marriage was, in its purest form, a ledger entry. Eleanor's father had gambled away 3 generations of land and left behind only a title with nothing attached to it. Edmund possessed a fortune built on coal and shipping, and a pressing need for the kind of ancient, unimpeachable name that money alone could never purchase. He required a wife of good lineage to silence a cousin who had begun, quietly, to question his fitness to hold the dukedom at all. It was a transaction, conducted with the same brisk efficiency Edmund's solicitors applied to any acquisition. Eleanor allowed herself to be acquired. She had, after all, very few alternatives left. The carriage journey to Summerley Hall took 3 days, and each hour of it was an exercise in agonizing proximity. They sat opposite one another, while the countryside dissolved into grey rain beyond the windows. Edmund did not read. He did not sleep. He held himself in a state of rigid, unnatural stillness that reminded Eleanor, uncomfortably, of a man bracing for a blow he expected to land at any moment. On the 2nd night, they stopped at a coaching inn in a market town whose name Eleanor never quite caught, and over a silent dinner of overcooked mutton, she made one attempt at conversation. "Do you have a preference for how I address you, Your Grace?" Edmund seems rather familiar for 2 people who exchanged 11 words at their own wedding. Something that might, in a different man, have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of his mouth before vanishing entirely. "Edmund will do. I find Your Grace exhausting when it comes from someone I am obligated to share a house with for the remainder of my natural life. How romantic. I didn't promise romance, Eleanor. Only solvency, and a title, and considerably more freedom than most husbands would grant a wife with an interest in ledgers rather than embroidery." He returned his attention to his plate, the brief, dry humor already retreating behind his customary stillness. "I would advise you not to expect more than that." She was 23, and far too practical to entertain any romantic illusions about the arrangement. Yet she found herself studying him, regardless the severe line of his jaw, the bruised shadows beneath his eyes, the way his left hand, resting on his knee, would occasionally curl into a fist before he forced it flat again, as though correcting an error only he could see. They arrived at Summerley at dusk on the third day. The estate rose out of the darkening moor like something carved rather than built, all narrow windows and heavy stone. The household staff stood in a neat, silent line to receive them, and Edmund introduced Eleanor to the housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, in a voice scraped hollow of anything resembling warmth. "Show her Grace to her rooms," he instructed, not quite looking at her. "I will be in my study. Will you not join me for a late supper, Your Grace?" Eleanor asked. He paused at the foot of the great staircase. For the briefest fraction of a second, his shoulders tightened. Some private battle fought and lost in an instant. "I dine alone. Good night." "Eleanor!" She stood alone in the vast entrance hall for a long moment after he had gone, listening to his footsteps fade down some corridor she had not yet learned the shape of, and told herself, with the same brisk practicality that had carried her through every other indignity of the past month, that disappointment over a stranger's coldness was a luxury she could not presently afford. She had married for security, not affection. Whatever this house eventually gave her, she resolved, she would take it without complaint, provided the roof did not leak and the accounts were honestly kept. It was, she would later admit to herself, a resolution built on considerably less certainty than she had allowed her own face to show that first night. That was the first night. She told herself it was the exhaustion of travel, the awkward strangeness of a marriage built on paper rather than affection. She ate a cold supper, alone in her vast, unfamiliar bedchamber, and listened to the clock in the corner tick past midnight, waiting for a knock at the connecting door that never came. The second night was the same. So was the third. By the end of the first week, a rigid, chilling routine had settled over the household, like frost. They met at breakfast, seated at opposite ends of a table long enough to seat 20, and exchanged only the barest civilities regarding the weather and the state of the gardens. Edmund spent his days riding the estate boundaries or closeted with his steward, and by every account he was a scrupulously fair landlord. He lowered rents where harvests had failed, repaired cottages the previous duke had ignored for a decade. He was, in the daylight hours, relentlessly, almost punishingly competent. But when the clock struck 7 each evening, something in him shifted. It began subtly, the color draining slowly from his face over dinner, his gaze drifting again and again to the tall windows, tracking the dying light with an expression that edged toward panic. By 8, without fail, he excused himself. "I have correspondence," he would say, the lie worn smooth from repeated use. He would climb the stairs, turn down the east corridor, and vanish until morning. He never touched her. He never lingered in a doorway, never brushed her hand, reaching for the teapot. It was not, Eleanor slowly came to understand, the indifference of a man who found his wife unappealing. It was the deliberate, mathematical distancing of a man attempting to quarantine himself from anyone he might harm. Dinner, in those first 2 weeks, followed its own precise choreography. Edmund would arrive promptly at 6, discuss the day's estate business with the careful neutrality of a man reading a report aloud, and watch the windows without appearing to watch them at all. Eleanor learned to read the exact moment the shift began, a faint stiffening of his shoulders, a slight lengthening of the pauses between his sentences, as though some internal clock had begun a countdown only he could hear. By 7:30, most evenings, he had stopped eating entirely, his fork resting untouched against the china, his gaze fixed on the darkening glass. "You needn't force conversation on my account," he told her once. On the 9th evening, catching her searching for some further remark about the weather. "I am aware I make for poor company after a certain hour. I had not noticed a decline," Eleanor said, which was, of course, an outright lie, and they both knew it, though neither commented further. Eleanor was not a woman given to weeping into a pillow, but by the 15th day, the silence had curdled from loneliness into something sharper, a restless, gnawing curiosity she could not reason her way out of. A practical woman, she told herself, cannot solve a problem she has not been permitted to understand, and so she began, quietly and methodically, to study Summerley Hall the way her husband studied his ledgers. She memorized the creak of the floorboards, the exact rotation of the maids' schedules. She noticed that the staff, though fiercely loyal to their master, moved through the house with an undercurrent of tightly wound anxiety. Mrs. Pruitt was a master of gentle evasion. When Eleanor asked why the Duke's valet, a quiet, watchful man named Owen Pratt, was never once seen before 10 in the morning, Mrs. Pruitt only smoothed her apron and said that His Grace preferred to dress himself, that he was a man of simple habits. It was, Eleanor recognized immediately, a lie. One did not retain a valet for 11 years, only to never require his services. She tried, once, to approach Mrs. Pruitt directly. She found the housekeeper in the linen room on the 12th day, counting sheets with brisk, practiced efficiency, and asked, as plainly as she dared, whether His Grace had always kept such peculiar hours. Mrs. Pruitt's hand stilled for only a moment before resuming their count. "His Grace has run this house exactly as he pleases since he inherited it, Your Grace, and I have found it a good deal easier over the years to let him." That is not an answer. "No, Ma'am." Mrs. Pruitt met her eyes then, and something in the older woman's expression softened, just slightly, into something almost like sympathy. "It is not my place to say more. I will tell you only this. Whatever you find, if you go looking, and I suspect you will, Your Grace, you have that look about you, I would ask you to remember that His Grace is a good man before you decide anything else about him." It was the closest thing to a warning Eleanor received before the 20th day, and she turned it over in her mind for a long while afterward, unable to decide whether it had been meant to frighten her away from the East Wing or to prepare her for what she would eventually find there. The geography of the East Wing became her obsession. Her own rooms sat in the sun-drenched south wing, overlooking the rose gardens. Edmund's official chambers were meant to adjoin hers, but the sheets in that room were never disturbed. The hearth never lit. He slept somewhere else entirely, down a narrow corridor tucked behind the library, at the end of which sat a single heavy door banded in iron, secured by a latch and deadbolt rather than any ordinary lock. She found it on the 20th day, having lost her way during a violent rainstorm while searching for a volume of poetry. The corridor beyond the baize door was colder than the rest of the house, the air gone stale and close. As she approached the iron-banded door, she heard it a low, dragging scrape, wood against wood, followed by a rhythmic, muffled thudding that raised the hair on her arms. "Your Grace." She spun to find Owen Pratt behind her, a stack of linens in his arms, his face arranged into a mask of polite terror. "This wing is draughty. His Grace prefers it kept shut, to conserve the heat. What is in that room?" "Owen. Storage. Ma'am. Broken furniture. Nothing fit for your eyes." He stepped sideways. A clear, silent request that she leave. Eleanor looked at the heavy bucket of water resting at his feet. One does not carry fresh water to a room full of broken furniture. She held his gaze a moment longer, then walked past him without another word. The dynamic between husband and wife shifted after that afternoon, though neither of them acknowledged it aloud. Eleanor stopped filling their silences with talk of weather. Instead, she watched him, and what she saw frightened her considerably more than the locked door ever had. On the 22nd day, he dropped a spoon at breakfast, and his sleeve rode up as he reached for it, revealing a raw, rope-burned welt circling his wrist. He yanked the cuff down before she could comment, his jaw tightening to stone. On the 24th day, he arrived with a split lip, claiming his horse had thrown its head. Eleanor had watched him ride. He was among the finest horsemen she had ever seen, and his mount was a placid, elderly gelding entirely incapable of the injury he described. He was unraveling. The polite, hollow shell he wore each morning was beginning to crack along seams only she seemed to notice. On the 25th day, she found him standing motionless in the stable yard at dawn, still in his night clothes, staring at nothing until his own groom gently steered him back inside without a word of explanation offered by either man. On the 26th, a maid dropped a tray of silver in the hallway outside his study, and Eleanor heard, through the closed door, a single sharp, involuntary cry that stopped as abruptly as it had started, swallowed back down before anyone could properly hear it. The storm came on the 27th night, tearing in off the moor with a violence that rattled every window in the house. Eleanor could not sleep. She lay awake counting the minutes until, somewhere past midnight, she heard it again. The scrape, the thud, and this time, beneath it, a sound that stopped her heart entirely. A man's voice, raw and pleading, begging someone unseen to hold the line. She rose. She took a candle. She walked the length of the cold east corridor in her bare feet, and when she reached the iron-banded door, she found it, for the first time in 27 days, unlatched, left open in the chaos of Owen Pratt's frantic dash through the storm to fetch supplies from the village, the bridge at the lower crossing having washed out and forced him the long way round. She pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, padded floor to ceiling in thick canvas and horsehair, lit by a single guttering lamp. A wooden chair stood empty in the centre, a length of canvas strap coiled on the seat. Edmund was not in the chair. He was curled on the floor in the far corner, his shirt torn open at the collar, his knuckles split and bleeding where he had struck the padded wall, his eyes open and utterly unseeing, fixed on some horror only he could perceive. "Hold the line," he was saying, over and over, his voice cracking. "Hold the line. Don't go back in. Stay here. Stay with me." Eleanor did not scream. She did not run for help. She set down her candle, crossed the room, and knelt in front of her husband, close enough to see the fine, violent tremor shaking his entire frame. "Edmund," she kept her voice low, level, entirely without fear, though her heart was slamming against her ribs. "Edmund, look at the floor. It is blue canvas. Feel it beneath your hands. You are at Summerley. It is the 27th of the month. There is a storm outside. Not artillery. You are safe. He did not hear her. Not at first. He fought against a memory that had swallowed him whole, and she stayed anchored beside him through all of it, repeating small, factual truths, the color of the walls, the hour on a clock he could not see, the sound of rain rather than cannon fire until, sometime past 4 in the morning, the violent tremors finally burned themselves out, and he collapsed into an exhausted, deathly stillness, his head coming to rest against the folds of her ruined nightgown. She did not move again until dawn. Oh, the deadbolt slid back with a metallic crack at 10 minutes past 6, and Edmund woke instantly, violently, scrambling backward until his shoulders struck the padded wall, his chest heaving, his eyes wild before they finally found hers. The raw panic in his face slowly curdled into something far heavier, a crushing, absolute shame. He turned his face away, pulling his torn sleeves down over the wounds on his wrists, and said nothing at all. Owen Pratt appeared in the doorway a moment later, soaked to the skin, a medical bag in one hand. He stopped dead at the sight of Eleanor sitting on the floor of the padded room. "Your Grace." His voice trembled. "The bridge I had to ride the long way round. I tried. It is all right." "Owen," Eleanor said, her own voice hoarse from a night spent talking a man back from a battlefield 11 years gone. "The storm has passed." She rose, her numb legs nearly giving way beneath her. Edmund caught her elbow before she could fall, his grip iron tight, his skin fever-hot the first time. She realized with a jolt that he had touched her voluntarily since handing her into the carriage outside the church. He released her instantly, as though she had burned him, and stared down at his own hand as though it belonged to some stranger capable of causing harm simply by existing. "Owen," he rasped, not looking at his wife. "Escort the Duchess to her rooms. Ensure the staff do not see her in this state." "No," Eleanor said. "I am not a scandal to be managed. Edmund, and I am not leaving you on the floor of a padded cell. Owen, draw a hot bath in His Grace's official chambers. The ones in the south wing?" "Not here." Owen hesitated, glancing nervously at his master. "Do it," Eleanor said, and something in her tone, the steel of a woman who had just survived a siege and now intended to dictate its terms, sent him hurrying down the corridor without further argument. "You should not have seen this," Edmund said quietly, staring at the floorboards. "You have no notion what you have tied yourself to." "I tied myself to a man who honors his debts, runs a profitable estate, and apparently fights ghosts in the dark," Eleanor replied. She extended her hand. "Now get up. The floor is cold, and I require tea." He looked at her, offered hand for a long moment, weighing, she suspected, the cost of crossing a boundary he had spent years constructing. In the end, he did not take it. He placed his palms flat against the floor and hauled himself up under his own strength, towering over her, battered and rigid, but he did not walk away. "Lead the way," he said, quietly. The negotiation took place that afternoon in the library, sunlight pouring through tall arched windows onto shelves of leather-bound volumes. Edmund sat in a wing-back chair by the cold hearth, freshly bathed and dressed, the physical trappings of the Duke of Summerley restored, though the illusion of composure was entirely gone. "How long?" Eleanor asked. From the settee opposite. She did not need to clarify the question. Since Waterloo, 11 years. He stared at the empty grate. I broke things for the first 4 years after I returned furniture. Windows. Once a footman's arm before Owen built the room. My father sent me to a specialist in London. Laudanum, leeches, and eventually the suggestion of an asylum in Surrey. I chose the room instead. I built it myself, with Owen's help, so that when the dark came, I could not harm anyone but myself. And you thought you could marry? And hide this from a wife forever? I thought, he said, his voice tightening, that if I provided you with enough wealth and enough distance, you would learn to ignore the eccentricities of a husband who preferred the night to himself. Society is built on marriages of mutual avoidance. I did not account for your curiosity. I am not curious. Edmund, I am your wife. In law and in fact. Eleanor rose from the settee and crossed the room to stand nearer the hearth. Did you never consider simply telling me, before the wedding, what I was agreeing to share a roof with? Would you have married me regardless? I do not know, she said honestly, but I would have entered this house with my eyes open, rather than spending 3 weeks convinced I had married a man who found me repugnant. That, at least, I might have been spared. Something in his expression flickered, genuine regret surfacing through the careful detachment he had maintained through the whole conversation. I did not consider that my silence would wound you in its own right. I had grown so accustomed to protecting others from the truth of it that I forgot the not knowing carries its own cruelty. It does. She let the admission settle between them for a moment before continuing. I watched my father destroy our family at the card tables because he refused to admit he had lost control of anything. I will not watch my husband chain himself to a chair because he refuses to ask for help. There is no help for this. He surged to his feet, pacing toward the window. Do you think this is a matter of will? When the sun sets, I smell smoke that is not there. I hear men screaming who have been dead for a decade. I cannot be reasoned out of it, because some part of my mind still believes I am standing in that farmhouse. You were very brave last night, but bravery runs out. Eleanor, pity runs out. Eventually you will look at me and see exactly what I am. A broken liability wearing a duke's coat. Who was Daniel Rourke? The name struck him like a physical blow. His shoulders dropped. He did not turn from the window. A private, attached to my company, 19 years old, an Irish farmhand who lied about his age to take the king's shilling. Edmund pressed his forehead to the cold glass. We were holding a farmhouse near La Haye Sainte. French artillery struck the outbuilding where 2 of our wounded lay. The roof came down. Daniel went back in to pull them clear. He got them out. The main beam fell before he could follow. I ordered the line to hold. We could not reach him in time. I stood there. Eleanor! And I listened to him die. The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor crossed the room and stood behind him, and placed her hand flat between his shoulder blades. He drew a sharp, fractured breath at the contact. You held the line, she said. That is what a commander does. You did not light that fire, and you did not put that beam over his head. I let a boy burn. You fought a war neither of you asked for. She did not remove her hand. Here are my terms. Your Grace, I will not pity you. I will not fear you. And I will not allow you to lock that door again. He turned to face her, searching her expression for the revulsion he clearly expected, and finding, instead, only a fierce, unromantic resolve. If I do not lock the door, I cannot promise your safety. Then I will learn to trust you regardless. Owen sleeps in the adjoining room if he must. But you will sleep in the chamber beside mine, not strapped to a chair like an animal. If you wake, you call for me. We will keep the lamps lit until dawn, for as long as it takes. You are asking for a life of exhaustion. I am asking for a marriage, she said. You may decide whether you would prefer that to a padded room. He reached up slowly and wrapped his hand around her wrist, his thumb settling over her pulse, as though needing proof that she was real and unafraid. Very well, he said, quietly. No locks. Owen Pratt found Eleanor alone in the morning room the following day, and stood twisting his hands for a long moment before he finally spoke. I have served His Grace since we were boys together. Your Grace, before ever there was a war to speak of. I was his father's stable-hand son. He taught me my letters in this very house, when neither of us had any notion what he would become, or what would happen to him after. Owen's voice caught, and he pressed on regardless. I have carried the key to that room for 7 years. I have sat outside that door more nights than I can properly count, and I confess, Your Grace, I had begun to believe I would carry that particular burden alone until one of us died of it. You are not alone in it any longer. Owen. No. Mum. He met her eyes, something like profound relief breaking through his customary composure. I do not think I have said thank you properly. For that, I should like to. Now, there is no need. There is every need, Owen said, quietly firm. You did not have to open that door. Most would have called for their own solicitor and a swift annulment, rather than sit on a cold floor until dawn. His Grace does not say such things aloud. Your Grace, but I have known him the whole of his life, and I have never once seen him look at anyone the way he has begun to look at you. He bowed and left before Eleanor could formulate any adequate reply, and she sat alone in the morning room for some time afterward, turning the valet's words over with a warmth she had not expected to feel, quite so early, into a marriage built on nothing more than a ledger and a bargain. Oh, the change was neither immediate nor magical. Trauma does not surrender simply because a bargain has been struck in a sunlit library. Edmund moved into the official master suite, the connecting door left deliberately ajar, and the night terrors did not stop. The worst of them came on the 12th night of the new arrangement. Eleanor woke to the sound of the connecting door slamming back against the wall, and found Edmund on his knees beside the bed, dragging air into his lungs in short, ragged gasps. His hands pressed flat against his ears as though trying to block out a sound only he could hear. The guns. He was saying, the guns. They won't stop. Tell them to stop. She did not touch him first. She had learned, by then, that an unexpected hand could tip him deeper, rather than pulling him free. She knelt a careful distance away and began speaking in the same low, even register she had used in the padded room. Edmund, listen to my voice. Not the guns. There are no guns. Feel the floor beneath your knees. It is oak, and it is cold, and it is 11 years since Waterloo. Not the summer of the battle itself. You are at Summerley, in your own house, and I am 3 feet away from you, and I am not going anywhere. It took the better part of 20 minutes before his breathing slowed, before his hands finally dropped from his ears, and his eyes cleared enough to find her face in the dim light. He looked, in that moment, entirely wrung out, ashamed in the particular way he always was afterward, and profoundly grateful in a manner he had not yet learned to voice aloud. "You should be asleep," he said hoarsely, "not kneeling on a cold floor at 3 in the morning, managing my ghosts. I find I sleep rather better knowing where the ghosts are than lying awake wondering," Eleanor said, and held out her hand, not to pull him anywhere. Simply an offer, left open, the way he had once offered his to her in the library. This time, he took it. On one Tuesday he woke tearing at his own collar, choking on smoke that did not exist. On a Thursday he hurled a crystal decanter across the room, certain he had glimpsed an enemy uniform in the glass. But the pattern shifted. Where once the isolation had let the panic spiral unchecked until it swallowed him whole, now a voice cut through it. Eleanor did not coddle him, did not stroke his hair and murmur that it had only been a dream. She knew the memory was, to him, entirely, violently real. Instead, she anchored him with blunt, factual precision. "Edmund, look at the curtains. They are grey. Listen to the clock. It is 3 in the morning. You are at Summerley." Owen hovered nearby with a sedative that grew, week by week, less and less necessary by the 3rd week of the new arrangement. Something fragile but genuine had settled over their daylight hours. The hollow distance at breakfast dissolved into real conversation, not of war, but of the estate. Mrs. Pruitt found Eleanor in the linen room one afternoon during that same week, in an odd echo of their conversation from the 12th day, and this time it was the housekeeper who broke the silence first. "The house has not sounded like this in 11 years. Your Grace," she said, folding a sheet with more care than the task strictly required. "I do not mean the master's troubles have ended. I expect they have not. Not fully. Not for a good while yet. But there is laughter in the breakfast room some mornings now, and I had quite forgotten what that sounded like in this house. I did very little. Mrs. Pruitt, I only refused to leave when the sensible course would have been to run. That is not little, Your Grace. That is rather the whole of it, in my experience." Mrs. Pruitt's usually composed expression softened into something almost maternal. "I told you once to remember he was a good man before you decided anything further about him. I find I ought to have added that you were rather a good deal braver than most, for staying long enough to see it for yourself." Eleanor discovered she possessed a sharp instinct for figures, and began reviewing the account books alongside her husband in the library, the great desk between them covered in tenant ledgers and crop yields. The miller at the lower crossing is skimming grain, she noted one afternoon, tapping a column of numbers. His yields have supposedly dropped by a fifth, yet he purchased 2 new draft horses last month. Edmund leaned over her shoulder to study the figures, close enough that she caught the warmth of him. Soap and leather and horses, grounding in its ordinariness. I will ride down tomorrow and present him the mathematics. Fear of discovery is a better motivator than eviction itself, and he has children to feed. Take me with you, Eleanor said. He glanced at her, surprised. It is hardly a duchess's errand. Confronting a tenant over stolen grain. I have spent a month learning every ledger in this house. I should like to see what the numbers look like standing in a field, rather than only on a page. He took her the following morning, and she watched him work, not the rigid, hollowed-out man of the dinner table, but someone entirely different, patient and shrewd, laying out the miller's own falsified accounts with a calm precision that left the man white-faced and full of immediate, effusive promises. Riding back to the hall afterward, Edmund was almost relaxed, describing with dry amusement the miller's sudden, Remarkable improvement in arithmetic, once faced with the alternative. "You are rather good at this," Eleanor said. "The daylight half of you, at least, the daylight half of me was, for a long while, the only half I permitted anyone to see." He said it without self-pity, simply as observation, and something in his tone told her the admission itself was a kind of progress neither of them commented on further. She looked up at him. The dark hollows beneath his eyes had begun, at last, to fade. A letter from her mother had arrived that same week, full of gently pointed questions about whether the Duke treated her with proper consideration, whether the household ran to her satisfaction, whether, and this last line had been underscored twice, she was truly happy in her situation. Eleanor had sat with the letter for the better part of an evening before composing her reply, weighing how much of the truth a woman in Bath, 3 days' journey removed, could reasonably be expected to understand or usefully act upon. In the end, she wrote only that His Grace was a man of considerable private burdens, that she had chosen to help him carry them rather than simply endure them at a distance, and that she had never in her life felt so certain of being precisely where she was meant to be. It was not the whole truth. It was, she decided, sealing the letter, a truth nonetheless, the kind that mattered rather more than the specifics her mother would never think to ask about, and that Eleanor had no intention of explaining by post, regardless. For the first time since the church, she saw not a broken soldier, but a formidable, capable man, and he caught her looking. The library seemed to hold its breath. He lifted his hand, slowly, and tucked a stray curl behind her ear, his fingers warm against her jaw. "You are a formidable creature." "Eleanor," he said. "Lo, I am merely observant," she managed, her breath unsteady. "You are the only solid thing in this house." He was leaning closer, and she was tilting her face up to meet him, when the library door banged open and Owen stood in the frame, flushed with mortification, a stack of post clutched to his chest. "Your Grace, my apologies. A letter? From the War Office. It came by special courier." Owen had never once, in the whole of the new arrangement, interrupted them in the library without a full hour's warning delivered through Mrs. Pruitt first, and Eleanor understood immediately, from the particular tightness in his face, that whatever the letter contained had frightened him nearly as badly as it was about to frighten his master. The temperature of the room dropped 10 degrees in an instant. Edmund stared at the heavy red wax seal as though it might detonate in his hand. He broke it. He read the looping official script standing perfectly still in the center of the library, and Eleanor watched the fine tremor return to his hands, spreading from one finger to his wrist, rattling the parchment against his cuff. He folded the letter into careful, precise quarters and dropped it onto the cold hearth, then turned for the door. Eleanor moved faster, stepping directly into his path. "What is in the letter?" "A bureaucratic formality. Nothing that concerns you." His eyes had gone distant, clouded, the temperature of his skin already dropping as he retreated behind his old armor. "You are a terrible liar." She walked past him, retrieved the letter, and unfolded it before he could stop her. It was a petition from a Mrs. Bridget Rourke of County Wexford, seeking a dependent's pension as the mother of a fallen soldier. Her son, Private Daniel Rourke, had been listed as missing in action following Waterloo, without a commanding officer's sworn testimony confirming the manner of his death. The Crown had recorded him a deserter, and his mother would receive nothing at all. To correct the record, the Duke of Summerley was required to appear before the Board of Pensions at Whitehall and testify, under oath, to the precise circumstances of Daniel Rourke's death. He would have to say it aloud, in a room full of strangers. He would have to admit he had listened to the boy burn. "I cannot do it," Edmund whispered. The words torn out of him raw. "I will send her £1,000 tomorrow. I will secure her a cottage, her whole life's comfort. But I cannot stand in that room and speak his name. £1,000 will not clear his name of desertion," Eleanor said quietly. "It will not tell his mother he did not run. He didn't run." Edmund spun, sending a stack of ledgers crashing to the floor, his chest heaving. "I know he didn't run. If I say it aloud, if I make it real again, the fire will take me under, and I will not survive it this time." He turned for the door, heading, she understood instantly, back toward the east wing and the room with no lock. No. Eleanor caught his sleeve, dug her heels into the carpet, and slammed the door shut with her free hand, putting her back against it. "We are done with the dark. Edmund, that letter is not asking you to relive it for no reason. It is asking you to hold the line for him one final time. I am broken," he roared, slamming his fist against the door beside her head, the wood splintering under the impact. "I cannot save him. I can barely save myself." She did not flinch. She reached up and held his face in both hands, forcing his panicked gaze to hers. "You do not have to save him. He is already gone. You only have to tell the truth and lay him to rest. I cannot go to London alone. The noise, the crowds, it sounds like the guns." "You are not going alone," Eleanor said. "I am coming with you. We leave at dawn." The carriage ride to London was a dark mirror of the journey to Summerley, taken nearly 2 months before, though this time they sat on the same bench rather than opposite one another, her shoulder pressed firmly to his. She did not fill the silence with idle talk. When his breathing grew too fast, she slid her hand into his, and he gripped her fingers hard enough to bruise, as though she were the only tether keeping him from the abyss. Somewhere past the halfway point, as the green countryside began surrendering to the grey sprawl of the city's outer edges, Edmund spoke without turning from the window. "I have rehearsed the words 12 times since we left. I know precisely what I intend to say, and still I cannot make myself believe I will manage it. Once I am standing in that room, you do not need to believe it yet," Eleanor said. "You only need to believe it for the length of one sentence. Spoken once, I will believe the rest for you until you catch up." He turned to look at her then, something unguarded and faintly astonished crossing his face, as though the notion that another person might simply carry a portion of his fear for him had genuinely never occurred to him before. They reached the Summerley townhouse in Mayfair by evening, its furniture draped in dust sheets, the air stale with disuse. The hearing was set for 9 the following morning. Dinner went untouched. Edmund paced the drawing room until midnight, flinching at every distant shout from the street below, hearing in the ordinary clatter of London an army encampment bracing for slaughter. "They are firing the ceremonial cannons in the park tomorrow," he said, staring out at the gas-lit street. "A royal birthday." The War Office clerk mentioned it as an afterthought. Eleanor's stomach dropped. Artillery. On the very morning he had to walk into that room and speak Daniel Rourke's name. "I'm going to fail tomorrow," he said, his voice flat. "I will shatter in front of the board, in front of his mother. I will disgrace us both." "Take off your shirt," Eleanor said. He blinked, startled entirely out of his spiral. "Eleanor, take it off." He obeyed, slowly, his fingers clumsy on the buttons. and beneath the linen she found a map of survival, written in scar tissue, a jagged line across his ribs from a bayonet, a puckered burn on his shoulder from a musket flash, and newer marks, the fading bruises where he had fought his own restraints in the dark. She pressed her palm flat over his heart, feeling it hammer beneath her hand, and did not look away from any of it. "I am not asking you to be unafraid tomorrow," she said quietly. "I am asking you to let me hold the line beside you tonight, so that you remember, tomorrow, what it feels like to be held rather than restrained." He made a sound low in his throat, something between a sob and her name, and gathered her against him with a desperation that had nothing left of the careful. "Distant stranger from the church, I do not deserve this," he murmured against her hair, his voice rough. "Whatever kindness you are offering me tonight, Eleanor, I have done nothing in this marriage to earn it." "You are not required to earn it," she said, drawing back just far enough to hold his gaze. "That is rather the entire point of a marriage, Edmund, though I understand no one thought to explain that part to either of us beforehand. I am not measuring what you have earned. I am choosing where I wish to be, and I wish to be exactly here, with exactly you, tonight and tomorrow, and for however many more difficult mornings follow it." What passed between them that night was not the practiced formality expected of a ducal marriage bed. It was raw and unhurried and entirely honest, each touch a small, deliberate act of proof that he was here, that she was here, that the war had not taken every part of him after all. He traced the line of her collarbone with a reverence that seemed almost disbelieving, as though he could not quite credit that anyone would choose, freely and without obligation, to remain this close to the wreckage he had spent 11 years convinced he was. She answered every hesitation in him, not with words, but with steadiness, meeting him exactly where he stood, rather than asking him to be anything other than precisely what a decade of war had left behind. Afterward, the fire burned low to embers, and Edmund lay with his arm around her, his breathing slow and even for the first time in longer than either of them could remember. The fine tremor that had lived permanently in his hands since the letter's arrival had, for this one quiet hour at least, gone entirely still. "The guns will sound tomorrow," he said quietly into the dark. Eleanor pressed a kiss to his shoulder. "And you will stand through them?" "Yes," he said, and the old hesitation in his voice was gone. "I will." Whitehall smelled of floor wax and old paper, its corridors lined with dark oak and clerks scurrying past with stacks of lives reduced to ink and ledgers. Eleanor sat on a hard bench outside the hearing chamber, while Edmund waited by the window in his formal robes, dark wool and a severe black cravat. Every inch the Duke of Summerley, except for the white-knuckled grip he kept on his walking stick. "The Duke of Summerley," a clerk announced, and the heavy doors opened. Edmund looked back at Eleanor once. She gave him a single, sharp nod, and he walked in. The chamber held 3 commissioners at a long table, and at the far end sat a small, grey-haired woman in threadbare mourning black, her hands folded with a quiet, dignified terror. Edmund's eyes went straight to her and did not leave. "Your Grace," the lead commissioner began, shuffling papers, his powdered wig slightly askew. "We appreciate your attendance on such short notice, and we are grateful for your willingness to assist in this matter." He cleared his throat, glancing at his fellow commissioners before continuing. "We are here to ascertain the fate of Private Daniel Rourke. Records indicate he broke ranks and fled during the engagement near La Haye-Sainte, absent a body. The Crown assumes incorrectly. Edmund's voice cut through the dusty air, loud and resonant and entirely steady. He turned his body to address the room, but spoke directly to the mother. Private Rourke did not break ranks. He was holding the south outbuilding when French artillery struck the barn behind us. The roof collapsed. He went back in to pull 2 wounded men clear of the doorway. His voice dropped, losing its aristocratic polish, taking on the rough cadence of a soldier. He pushed them to safety. The main beam came down. He was trapped beneath it. I ordered my men to hold the line. We could not reach him. Mrs. Rourke pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. He burned to death. Madam, holding that doorway open for men he had never met before that week. He was the bravest 19-year-old I have ever commanded. Silence fell, broken only by a clerk's scratching quill. Then, low and concussive, the first ceremonial cannon fired in the park beyond the windows, rattling the glass. A second followed. Eleanor, outside the door, surged to her feet, gripping the handle, ready to break it down. Inside, Edmund flinched violently as the third cannon fired, his shoulders snapping toward his ears, a flash of pure animal panic tearing across his face. He stared at the table, slipping. Then Mrs. Rourke rose. She pushed back her chair, ignored the startled commissioners, and crossed the room to stand directly before the trembling Duke. A fourth cannon fired. Edmund squeezed his eyes shut. She reached out and laid her small, worn hand over his white-knuckled grip on the walking stick. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice thick but steady. "Thank you for bringing my boy home to me." Edmund opened his eyes and looked down at her hand, at her tear-streaked face, not pity in it, but the fierce, recognizing gratitude of a fellow survivor. The fifth cannon fired. He did not flinch. He took one slow breath, and the smell of smoke did not come, and the screaming did not echo, and there was only floor wax and lavender water, and the plain fact that the truth had finally been spoken aloud and had not, after all, destroyed him. He released the walking stick and covered her hand with his own. It was an honor to serve beside him. Mrs. Rourke. He turned to the commissioners, the cold authority of a duke settling back over his spine. "You will strike the word deserter from the record today. You will grant this woman the full pension owed her, with back pay to the date of his death. If I discover any delay, you will answer to me in the House of Lords. It will be done, Your Grace." The commissioner stammered. Edmund gave Mrs. Rourke a small, formal bow and walked out through the double doors, where Eleanor stood waiting, pale and rigid. He stopped. He looked at her, the crushing weight he had carried for 11 years, visibly gone from his shoulders, leaving him exhausted, battered, and lighter than she had ever seen him. His walking stick clattered to the floor. Forgotten, he crossed the distance between them in a single stride and buried his face in her hair, indifferent to the clerks watching. To every rule of propriety he had spent a lifetime honoring, she held him just as fiercely, feeling the steady, unhurried rhythm of his heart against her own chest for the first time since the wedding. "It's done," he whispered against her ear. "It's finally done." They walked out of Whitehall together into a bright wash of late summer sun, breaking through London smoke, the city loud and chaotic and entirely alive around them. And Edmund did not flinch at any of it. He offered her his arm. She took it, and they stepped off the curb into the noise, leaving the ghosts finally behind them in the ink and the dust. A year passed before Eleanor understood just how much ground they had covered since that first cold night at Summerley. The East Wing corridor had been reopened, the padded room dismantled entirely, its canvas walls stripped away and the space converted, at Eleanor's quiet insistence, into a second estate office where Edmund now reviewed accounts most mornings with the same steady competence he brought to everything in daylight. The nights had not become perfect. Some still brought him half upright and gasping, chasing memories that 11 years of silence had only buried, never healed, but they came less often now, and never again alone in the dark. Mrs. Bridget Rourke wrote twice a year, faithfully, from the small cottage her pension had secured in County Wexford, and each letter closed the same way, with a blessing for the Duke who had told the truth when it cost him the most, and a report on the roses she had planted beside her son's memorial stone, which, she said, without fail, were blooming beautifully that season. On a bright morning the following spring, Eleanor found Edmund in the stable yard, quiet and still, watching the sunrise the way he once had in the depths of his worst episodes, except this time his shoulders were loose, his hands open and easy at his sides. "You are not remembering the war," she said, coming to stand beside him. It was not quite a question. No. He glanced down at her, and the small, private smile he had learned to wear only for her, these days spread slowly across his face. "I find I have finally run out of room in my mind for old ghosts. You have taken up rather too much space there yourself. How inconsiderate of me." "Considerably," he agreed, and drew her against his side as the sun cleared the moor. Warm and ordinary and entirely unremarkable, exactly the kind of morning he had once believed himself no longer entitled to have. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is not survive a battlefield, but finally step out of the dark and ask someone to hold the line beside him. Eleanor and Edmund's marriage began as a transaction and became, slowly and honestly, a shared trench proof that love is not always the easy kind found in ballrooms, but sometimes the harder kind found in a padded room at 3 a.m, refusing to let go. If you have ever loved someone fighting a war no one else could see, I hope this story reminded you that presence is often worth more than any cure. If Eleanor and Edmund's journey moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this with someone who understands what it means to hold the line for another person. And subscribe with the notification bell on for more deeply grounded historical stories. Tell me in the comments which moment stayed with you longest. I read every one, and I will see you in the next story.